The Mortimer family believed a lieutenant named Charles P. Mortimer vanished in Vietnam. His name survived in kitchen stories, folded letters, and a photograph of a young officer without a caption. Yet the wall holds no matching line. An old note remains the paper, thinned by time, signed only C. P. M. A niece says quietly, "We didn't invent him." It is hard to imagine carrying a name that records refuse to confirm and choosing to carry it anyway. Mortimer was 24 when the routine became something his family could count on. Every Sunday, without fail, a letter arrived. The envelope was always the same size. The handwriting leaned slightly to the right. The return address never changed even when the postmark did. His sister learned to recognize the weight of it before opening the mailbox. She learned the sound it made when it slid through her fingers. Thin paper, careful folds. A habit steady enough to believe in. He wrote on Sundays, because Sundays were quieter. That was how he explained it. "It's the only day my head stays still long enough," he said once, half joking, half pleading. The line stayed with her because it sounded like a promise and a warning at the same time. He never described where he was in detail. He avoided names of places. He described the heat instead, the way it sat on his shoulders even at night, the way his boots stayed damp no matter how long he left them out. The letters always opened the same way. A greeting, a question about home, then reassurance. He wanted his sister to know he was eating. He wanted her to know he was careful. He wanted her to know he was still himself. At the bottom of every page before the signature, he repeated one sentence with small variations: he would be back in time for the wedding. That wedding became a fixed point in his writing. He counted backward from it. 8 weeks to go, he wrote once. 6 if everything lines up. He asked about the dress. He asked about the flowers. He joked that he would complain if the cake was dry. These details mattered because they made the future specific, not vague, not symbolic. A date, a place, a chair with his name on it. On the day he left, he carried a ring in his pocket. It was not a wedding ring. It belonged to the family. Gold worn thin at the edges. Inside a single letter was engraved M. He had taken it without ceremony. No speech, no explanation. His sister noticed it only because she had been looking for it earlier that morning. When she asked, he shrugged. "I'll bring it back," he said. "It's safer with me." He wore it on a chain tucked under his shirt. The metal rested against his skin. He touched it when he was nervous. That was a habit he had carried since childhood, rubbing his thumb over the engraving when he needed to think. It grounded him. It reminded him of weight of something solid that existed outside the day's instructions. There was a moment of normal life before he left. Coffee on the stove. The radio playing too loudly. His sister complaining that he never finished packing until the last minute. He stood in the doorway, bag at his feet, listening. He smelled burnt toast. He laughed when she waved the spatula at him like a weapon. These things stayed because they were ordinary, because nothing in that kitchen suggested it would be the last morning they shared. He did not talk about fear directly. He talked around it. He asked practical questions instead. What should he do with the old car if it broke down while he was gone? Where should the spare key be kept? Who would remind their father to take his medication? These were not the questions of someone convinced he was invincible. They were the questions of someone trying to control what he could. In one letter written weeks later, he admitted one thing. "I don't like flying here," he wrote. No elaboration. No explanation. Just that sentence, sitting alone, between paragraphs about weather and food. His sister read it twice. She folded the page back along the crease and put it away. She did not show it to anyone. It felt private, like a confession, slipped in by accident. The last letter arrived without a date. The postmark was blurred. The envelope looked as if it had been handled too many times before it reached the mailbox. Inside, the tone was different. Shorter sentences. Less humor. He wrote about waiting, about days spent listening for instructions that did not come, about the ring which he mentioned for the first time. "Still have it," he wrote. "Don't worry." There was a line that did not fit with the rest. "If this one takes longer, tell her I tried." His sister read that sentence and felt something tighten in her chest. She could not explain why. She told herself it meant delays, logistics, the ordinary frustrations he never bothered to describe. She folded the letter and placed it with the others. After that Sunday, nothing came. At first, the family adjusted their expectations rather than their beliefs. Mail was slow. Routes changed. They told themselves to be patient. His sister checked the mailbox every day instead of once. She listened for the sound of the truck. She learned the difference between footsteps and tires. When weeks passed, she wrote to him. Then again, her letters came back unopened. They did not receive a telegram. No official notice arrived to explain the gap. No document used the word missing. There was only the accumulation of days without his handwriting. Only the calendar pages turning toward a wedding date that no longer made sense. The question of where and when he disappeared remained tangled in fragments. The last known location was implied rather than stated. A transfer mentioned in passing. A wait that stretched longer than expected. A movement that may have happened or may have been postponed. His sister tried to reconstruct it from memory, laying the letters out on the table, aligning sentences like landmarks. The trail stopped abruptly. A call came weeks later from someone who did not leave a name. The voice was careful, almost rehearsed. It confirmed that Charles had been assigned, that his unit had moved, that records were being reviewed. It did not confirm his fate. It did not deny it either. The call ended with a phrase that offered neither comfort nor clarity. "We'll be in touch." The wedding went ahead without him. An empty chair stood where he was supposed to sit. His sister wore the dress he had asked about. She noticed the ring was gone from the drawer where it usually rested. Only then did she fully understand that he had not planned to leave it behind. Years later, the family would argue about the details. The exact date of the last letter. The tone of the voice on the phone. Whether anyone had used his full name or just Charles. These arguments did not change what mattered. A young man had stepped into a role, carried a promise forward, and then slipped out of reach without the paperwork that usually followed. He did not leave behind a grave. He did not leave behind a final message meant to explain everything. He left behind habits. Sundays without letters. A ring that never came home. A plan spoken aloud often enough that others continued to expect it long after it stopped being possible. Someone once asked his sister when she knew he was not coming back. She paused before answering. "When I stopped setting aside the letters I wanted to show him," she said. That moment did not arrive with an announcement. It arrived quietly, in the middle of an ordinary week, when the future he had described no longer fit the present she was living. What made his fate unresolved was not the lack of events, but the lack of confirmation. The space where a record should have been stayed empty. The name Charles P. Mortimer hovered between memory and documentation. He had lived solidly enough to be missed. He had disappeared gently enough to leave room for doubt. Before that doubt hardened into something permanent, there was only a young man writing on Sundays, counting the weeks to a wedding, rubbing his thumb over a letter engraved inside a ring, and believing at least long enough to write it down. That he would be there when the music started. The record should have caught him. That was the assumption everyone carried forward without saying it aloud. Names were written down, movements logged, losses accounted for. Charles P. Mortimer had existed in enough tangible ways that the idea of him simply slipping past documentation felt temporary, like a clerical delay that would resolve itself once the right file was opened. His sister began with the most obvious place. She wrote his name in careful block letters on government forms, pressing hard enough that the pen nearly tore the paper. Rank lieutenant. Age 24. Distinguishing features none she thought would matter. She enclosed copies of his letters, the photograph without a caption, and waited. Weeks turned into months. Replies arrived that acknowledged receipt but offered nothing concrete. The language was precise and empty at the same time. No matching record located. Search ongoing. Name under review. Each letter carried official weight, but none carried him. She started reading lists. At first it was just scanning, letting the eye move quickly, trusting that recognition would happen without effort. Then it became deliberate, finger tracing each line, reading middle initials out loud, looking for patterns that might explain a discrepancy. Mortimer appeared, but not him. Edward Mortimer. Arthur Mortimer Rowe. Men with similar ages, similar timelines, wrong ranks. One afternoon, sitting at the table with papers spread like a map she could not navigate, she said his name out loud. Charles P. Mortimer. Hearing it did not make it clearer. It sounded solid, complete. It sounded like it should belong somewhere official. A clerk at a military archive answered her call months later. The voice was neutral practiced. "We don't have a lieutenant by that exact name," the clerk said. We do have a few Mortimers. She read them off one by one. None matched. When asked about the initial, the clerk paused. Initials are where errors happen, she said. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're dropped. Dropped where exactly was never explained. A former officer reached through a friend, remembered serving with someone called Mortimer. The memory was vague, shaped more by time than certainty. Good with maps, the man said. Quiet. Kept notes. When pressed, he hesitated. I can't swear to the first name. That was the closest anyone came to placing Charles near a specific unit. It was not enough to anchor him. The family began to doubt their own precision. Had they added the P later? Had they assumed a rank he never held? The photograph offered no answers. The uniform was correct for an officer, but insignia could be misread by anyone who wanted to see something specific. The ring, once a grounding object, now felt like a symbol, with too many possible meanings. His sister replayed conversations in her head, searching for exact phrasing. She remembered him saying, "Call me a lieutenant if it makes you feel better." It had sounded like a joke at the time. Now it sounded like a crack where certainty might have slipped through. There were moments when she wondered if the name had shifted in transit, altered by paperwork and distance. Charles P. Mortimer, becoming something adjacent but unrecognizable. A first name misspelled. An initial mistaken for a surname. A line entered twice under two identities that later blurred together. She kept the last letter close during these searches. The paper had softened further. The ink faded unevenly. She traced the signature with her finger. C. P. M. It did not look like an invention. It looked like muscle memory, like someone signing without thinking. When doubt crept in, it did so quietly. Not as an accusation, but as a question that refused to leave. What if the memory of him had been shaped by repetition rather than record? What if the family had agreed on a version of Charles that smoothed over inconsistencies they never wanted to confront? These thoughts felt disloyal. She pushed them away. She reminded herself of Sundays of envelopes, of the weight of the ring in her palm when she held it once before he left. These were not abstractions. They were experiences. Still, the longer the search went on, the harder it became to ignore the gaps. The wall, when she finally visited, was overwhelming in its scale. Names flowed together, each carved with equal certainty. She ran her fingers along the stone, scanning for Mortimer. It appeared, but not him. The letters were precise, unyielding. She stood there longer than she meant to. A volunteer asked if she needed help. "I'm looking for someone," she said. The volunteer asked for the name. When she spoke it, the words sounded smaller than the stone. The volunteer shook his head gently. "He's not here," he said. That sentence echoed later, not as a conclusion, but as a complication. The family's conversations changed tone after that visit. Where once they spoke confidently about what had happened to Charles, they now spoke conditionally. If he was there, if that was his unit. These phrases crept in without permission. No one challenged them, but no one embraced them either. An older relative suggested that perhaps Charles had been recorded under a different name entirely. A nickname, a middle name, someone else's paperwork. The suggestion landed awkwardly. It did not feel helpful, but it did not feel impossible. The archive sent one final letter. It listed names that had been reviewed. It explained procedures. It thanked the family for their patience. It did not mention Charles P. Mortimer again. What remained was a man defined by what could not be found. His existence pressed against the edges of official history, without breaking through. Each attempt to locate him ended with a redirect, a near match a file that belonged to someone else. His sister kept the letters anyway. She kept the photograph. She kept the ring, now returned to its drawer. These items did not prove anything to anyone outside the family, but they continued to shape how Charles was remembered inside it. There was a moment years later when a younger family member asked a simple question. Was Uncle Charles real? The room went quiet. His sister answered without hesitation. "Yes," she said. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. It did not come from documents. It came from lived time. Yet even as she said it, she understood the cost of that certainty. Holding on to it meant accepting that some lives leave traces that do not align neatly with systems designed to record them. It meant living with the possibility that Charles existed fully, and still left behind a trail that could not be followed to an ending. In the absence of confirmation, the family learned a different way of remembering him. not through dates and designations, but through habits and promises, through the expectation of letters on Sundays, through the chair he was meant to occupy, through a ring engraved with a single letter that no archive could catalog. Charles P. Mortimer did not disappear from their lives all at once. He faded unevenly, resisting erasure in some places, while slipping away in others. The more the records failed to hold him, the more tightly the family held to what they had. What began as a search for proof became something else entirely. It became a confrontation with the limits of documentation, a realization that not every story fits cleanly into the spaces prepared for it. Charles remained suspended between what was remembered and what was recorded. Neither side could fully claim him. And in that tension, the family carried forward, unsure whether they were preserving a truth or protecting themselves from a different one they were not ready to face. The search changed when the work moved out of filing cabinets and into databases. Decades after the letters stopped, a modern researcher came to the Mortimer name with no emotional inheritance. He did not grow up hearing it spoken with care. He encountered it as a problem, a lieutenant who should have left a record and did not. The first thing he noticed was repetition not of Charles, but of the surname paired with shifting identities. Mortimer appeared attached to other men. Mortimer O'Connor, Michael O'Connor. Variations that looked unrelated until timelines were laid on top of each other. Service dates overlapped. Units aligned too closely to be coincidence. One name seemed to replace another at the edge of a transfer. The researcher printed charts and spread them across his desk. Lines intersected where they should not have. A lieutenant listed on one roster vanished the same week another officer appeared under a different surname. Rank shifted slightly. Initials moved. The paper trail bent without breaking. He contacted the Mortimer family with caution. This was not a revelation meant to be delivered dramatically. It was a hypothesis fragile and reversible. Still, it carried weight. If correct, it suggested that Charles P. Mortimer might not be a single person in the way the family had believed. He might be a composite assembled from partial records, reinforced by repetition, solidified by grief. A call was arranged. The oldest surviving relative listened, without interrupting. When the explanation finished, she said one sentence. "Are you telling us he never existed?" The researcher paused. "I'm saying the records may describe more than one man," he replied. The distinction mattered, but it landed unevenly. Photographs were requested. The image of the young officer was scanned, enlarged, studied. The uniform details were cross-checked against unit standards. Nothing contradicted the possibility that it belonged to an O'Connor rather than a Mortimer. The lack of a name on the back now felt consequential rather than careless. The researcher reached out to the O'Connor descendants. Their family history included a Michael, who had served, transferred, and never spoken much about that period afterward. There were gaps there too. Not the same gaps, but ones that could align if forced gently enough. A meeting took place in a quiet office. Two families sat across from each other, bound by overlapping fragments. The ring engraved with M was placed on the table. The O'Connor family had never seen it before. They did not recognize it. That neither confirmed nor denied anything. "What did he write about?" one of the O'Connors asked. The Mortimer relative described Sundays. The wedding promised the habit of reassurance. The O'Connor descendant shook her head slowly. "He wrote like that," she said, meaning Michael. "Always telling people not to worry." The researcher watched the exchange carefully. These moments were where theories either collapsed or gained dangerous momentum. Similarities could illuminate, but they could also mislead. Families learned patterns from each other all the time. Memory was contagious. The family Bible surfaced during this phase of the search. Inside names were written in careful script, but ranks had been added later in a different hand. Lieutenant appeared beside Charles P. Mortimer in ink that did not match the rest. That addition had felt authoritative for years. Now it felt provisional. The hypothesis sharpened. At some point, two narratives may have merged. A Mortimer letter writer, an O'Connor officer. Shared dates, shared habits. Over time, distinctions blurred, especially as confirmation never arrived to correct them. The emotional pressure shifted. If Charles was not singular, then the grief had been focused incorrectly. The family faced a new question that felt heavier than the original search. If he was assembled from parts, who had they been mourning? The researcher emphasized uncertainty. "This doesn't erase him," he said. "It changes how he's defined." The words were meant to reassure. They did not fully succeed. Objects took on new roles. The letters were reread for clues of voice rather than proof of identity. The photograph was no longer evidence of a specific man, but of an era and posture. The ring became less about ownership and more about intention. Someone had carried it. Someone had meant to return it. One evening, after the researcher left, the family gathered around the table where the letters were spread. A younger member asked, "Does it matter if he was one person or two?" No one answered immediately. The question hovered, demanding a response that logic could not provide. The oldest relative spoke last. "We waited," she said. "That part is real." Her voice did not shake. Waiting had shaped the family calendar, the tone of conversations, the way hope was rationed. Those effects did not dissolve under reinterpretation. The modern tools offered possibilities, but not closure. Databases suggested overlap. Algorithms highlighted inconsistencies. Yet none could explain who held the pen that signed C.P.M. or who touched the ring before boarding whatever carried him away. The researcher documented his findings carefully. He avoided declarative language. He noted probabilities, not conclusions. He understood that presenting certainty where none existed would do harm. Still, the file he compiled altered the shape of the story permanently. Charles P. Mortimer began to look less like a missing record and more like a boundary case, where human memory and institutional record-keeping rubbed against each other until friction produced something new. Not fabrication. Not clarity. Something in between. When the family was asked whether they wanted the hypothesis included in any public submission, they declined. "Not yet," they said. That decision was not avoidance. It was preservation. The name had carried them for too long to be dismantled quickly. The discovery did not resolve the central question. It complicated it. It suggested that existence could be layered, that a person could be formed from converging traces and still exert real force on the lives left behind. Charles P. Mortimer remained unlisted on the wall. That fact did not change. What changed was the understanding of how names could travel, collide, and fuse over time. The modern search did not give the family an ending. It gave them a deeper beginning, one that demanded they reconsider not only who Charles was, but how they had come to know him at all. The attempt to rebuild Charles P. Mortimer began with numbers rather than memories. The Defense POW, MIA accounting agency, assigned a specialist who approached the case with practiced restraint. There was no assumption of loss, no promise of recovery. Only the question of whether fragments, biological, bureaucratic, genealogical, could be aligned closely enough to justify further action. Charles entered the system as a name without coordinates, a profile defined more by absence than by location. Family members were asked for DNA. The request arrived by mail, folded neatly, written in language that avoided emotion. It explained procedures, probabilities, limitations. It did not mention Charles by name in the opening paragraph. He appeared later, reduced to a reference number. The oldest relative read the letter twice, then placed it beside the ring on the table. Gold and paper, two forms of evidence. Neither guaranteed anything. A cousin volunteered first. She filled the small vial with care, sealing it tightly. "If this helps," she said, handing it over, as if usefulness could be transferred through gesture alone. Another followed. Then another. Samples traveled from California to a lab that had never heard stories about Sundays or weddings. The specialist reviewed the incoming data. Mortimer lines branched outward across decades, tracing migrations and marriages. Patterns emerged, then stalled. No sample aligned with any unidentified remains on file. No partial match suggested a path forward. Each result arrived clean, definitive, and unhelpful. A report was generated. Its language was precise. No statistically significant association. Insufficient correlation. It concluded with a sentence that closed doors gently but firmly. No further action recommended at this time. The family gathered again. The report lay open, its margins untouched. A younger member read the final line aloud, then stopped. So he said, "That's it." No one answered immediately. The specialist joined a follow-up call. His voice was calm, unhurried. He explained what the report did and did not mean. "This doesn't tell us who wrote the letters," he said. "It doesn't tell us who wore the ring. It tells us only that the genetic trail doesn't intersect with known remains." Someone asked whether records could be missing pages. The specialist acknowledged that possibility. Files from that period were incomplete. Transfers were sometimes logged separately. Paper degraded. Information could be lost without intent. He did not promise that searching harder would change the outcome. Attention returned to the letters. Handwriting analysis was considered briefly, then set aside. Too many variables. Too few confirmed samples. The signature CPM resisted categorization. It belonged to a hand, not a database. The photograph underwent another examination. High resolution revealed details previously overlooked. A slight tilt of the cap. A crease in the uniform that suggested frequent adjustment. The posture was relaxed but alert. Someone accustomed to standing still while waiting. The image did not yield a name. It yielded a temperament. One of the relatives noticed something small. The chain around his neck barely visible beneath the collar. He wore the ring there, she said. The observation did not advance the investigation. It anchored the image to the object that had traveled through the family for decades. The specialist requested enlistment records again, this time focusing on intake rather than deployment. A partial file surfaced. Pages were missing. The remaining entries listed a Mortimer first name abbreviated, middle initial smudged. Rank unclear. The ambiguity felt deliberate, though it was likely just damage. What if someone else filled these out, a relative asked. What if he wasn't careful? The question reframed the problem. Instead of asking where Charles went, it asked how Charles might have been recorded imperfectly while still present. The report did not change the family's understanding of loss. It changed their relationship to expectation. Scientific hope had been introduced, tested, and withdrawn. What remained was quieter but more durable. The knowledge that effort had been made without yielding confirmation. The specialist offered one final clarification. Some cases don't resolve because the person wasn't lost in the way we expect, he said. Sometimes they were absorbed into other records. He did not expand on that thought. He did not need to. After the call, the family stayed seated longer than necessary. The ring was passed from hand to hand. Its surface was warm from contact. Someone traced the engraved letter with a thumb, repeating the gesture Charles had made years earlier. The motion felt inherited. A relative asked, "If there's no body, then who are we answering to?" The question was not rhetorical. It carried weight. Mourning without remains had shaped their rituals. Now science had confirmed that remains might never enter the story at all. The specialist report was filed away. It joined other documents that failed to provide resolution but altered perspective. Each attempt to define Charles more precisely seemed to reveal how resistant he was to singular definition. The family began to speak differently about him, not as a case to be solved, but as a presence reconstructed from decisions. Writing on Sundays, carrying a ring, making a promise specific enough to be remembered decades later. These details did not require verification to matter. One evening, a relative laid out the letters in chronological order again. The smell of old paper filled the room. The sound of pages, shifting, echoed softly. Reading them now, the writer noticed patterns that had nothing to do with rank or unit. The way reassurance preceded information. The way future plans were repeated, as if repetition could secure them. If he wasn't one person, someone said carefully, then someone learned how to sound like him. The idea was unsettling. It suggested intention, where the family had assumed continuity. It suggested that identity could be shared or transferred under pressure. The forensic phase ended without ceremony. No press release, no announcement, just a closed file marked incomplete. Charles P. Mortimer remained unaccounted for in the terms the agency required. Yet the process left traces. It clarified what could not be proven, and in doing so, sharpened what remained undeniable. Someone had lived long enough to be remembered. Someone had written with enough consistency to shape expectation. Someone had carried an object meant to return home. The specialist sent a final note. It thanked the family for their cooperation. It offered to reopen the case if new material emerged. It did not suggest that such material was likely. The ring returned to its place. The letters were stored again, this time with the report. Paper and metal sharing a box that now represented the full extent of what could be established. Charles was no closer to being located. He was, however, more clearly defined by the limits of recovery. Science had approached him and stopped. What lay beyond that stopping point belonged to another kind of knowledge. The forensic reconstruction did not rebuild Charles as a body. It reconstructed the boundary around him, a line marking where evidence ended and memory continued. Within that boundary, the family adjusted not toward certainty, but toward acceptance of ambiguity that did not erase attachment. Charles P. Mortimer remained a name carried forward, not because it could be proven, but because it had already done its work. It had shaped waiting. It had shaped hope. It had shaped the way the family understood what it meant to lose someone without ever being told to stop looking. The shift did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as permission. For years, the family had spoken about Charles P. Mortimer as if certainty were just one document away. The search assumed that the problem was external, a missing file, a misfiled name, a delayed confirmation. What changed now was not the evidence, but the willingness to speak about what had never been said plainly. The oldest living relative asked for the letters to be brought out again. Her hands shook slightly, as she held them not from age alone, but from the weight they had carried for so long. She did not read them. She stacked them, carefully aligning the edges. "No one ever showed us a death notice," she said. The room went still. It was the first time the sentence had been spoken without qualifiers. No one corrected her. No one asked for clarification. She continued slower now. "We assumed there was one. We assumed it came to someone else." The assumption had lived quietly in the family, passed down without being examined. It had allowed mourning to begin without forcing a confrontation with uncertainty. Another relative added something that surprised everyone. "I don't remember anyone using his middle name," she said. The P came later. That detail landed heavily. The initial had been treated as fixed for decades. Hearing it described as an addition changed its role entirely. The photograph was turned over. The back was blank. Someone had written a name there years later, in pencil, then traced it over in ink. The handwriting belonged to no one who remembered doing it. The act itself had been invisible, absorbed into the story without comment. A younger family member asked the question that had hovered for months. So who were we waiting for? The phrasing mattered. It did not accuse. It invited honesty. The oldest relative closed her eyes briefly. "We were waiting for the end of the waiting," she said. The answer did not define Charles. It defined the family. As more stories surfaced, contradictions appeared. Dates shifted. Descriptions conflicted. One person remembered Charles visiting home in uniform. Another insisted that never happened. These differences had always existed, but they had been smoothed over by repetition. Now they were allowed to stand. Someone mentioned a conversation from years earlier, spoken in a kitchen much like the one where the Sunday letters had once been opened. A relative had said maybe there were two of them. At the time, it had been dismissed as confusion. Now it sounded prescient. The idea that Charles might be a convergence, rather than a single stable identity, no longer felt like a threat. It felt explanatory. It accounted for the overlaps, the near matches, the way certainty had always required effort to maintain. This did not mean the family believed Charles was imaginary. The letters existed. The habits existed. The waiting existed. What changed was the understanding of how those elements might have come together. The oldest relative touched the ring, resting on the table between them. "Someone carried this," she said. "That part is real." No one argued. The object anchored the conversation. It resisted abstraction. A narrator might want to frame this as a moment of clarity, but clarity was not what followed. What followed was relief mixed with grief of a different kind. Grief not for a man lost, but for the version of certainty that had organized decades of remembrance. One family member admitted something quietly. "I was afraid to say it out loud," she said, "that maybe we didn't know him as well as we thought." The fear had kept questions buried. Speaking it now did not erase the past. It loosened its grip. The letters were read again, this time not as testimony, but as voice. The reader noticed how often the writer avoided specifics, how reassurance took precedence over description, how the future was described in terms of events rather than locations. These patterns could belong to many people. They did not diminish the care behind them. If it was more than one person, someone said, then someone taught us how to miss him. The sentence held a strange gratitude. It acknowledged the function Charles had served in the family narrative. He had given shape to uncertainty. The family spoke about the wedding again. The empty chair. The dress worn anyway. These memories had been fixed around Charles as a singular absence. Now they were recontextualized. The absence had been a container for something larger, the shock of not knowing how to stop waiting. There was no vote, no declaration. No one announced a new official version of events. Instead, the family agreed on what they would no longer insist upon. They would no longer claim to know exactly who Charles P. Mortimer was in administrative terms. They would no longer correct each other when details differed. One relative said, "We can tell the story without proving it." The statement was not a surrender. It was a choice. The letters were returned to their box. The photograph was placed on top. The ring remained outside, held a moment longer. The physical order of these items had always implied hierarchy. Now it felt like balance. The truth that emerged was not a solution. It was a reorientation. Charles had been a name that allowed the family to speak about loss without explaining it. He had been a focal point, a way to gather disparate fragments into a narrative that could be carried forward. Understanding this did not cheapen the waiting. It honored it. Waiting had been real work. It had shaped relationships, decisions, and the tone of family life. It had taught patience, but also restraint. The narrator cannot claim to know what it felt like, to realize that certainty had been partly constructed. But it is possible to recognize the courage it takes to let that construction soften without collapsing entirely. Charles P. Mortimer remained present in the family, but differently now. Less as a fixed figure, more as a shared effort. A name that had held space for grief when no other language was available. In letting go of the demand for closure, the family did not lose him. They gained a truer understanding of what he had been to them. Not a confirmed casualty, not a resolved case, but a human-shaped answer to a question they were not ready to ask when the letters stopped arriving. The human truth was not about whether Charles existed exactly as remembered. It was about why the family needed him to, and why even now they chose to keep his name not as proof, but as acknowledgement of the years shaped around it. What endured was not certainty, but practice. After the investigation slowed and then stopped, the family faced a choice that felt deceptively small. A form had been offered, polite and procedural, asking whether they wished to submit a new name for consideration, not to the wall, not officially, but to a secondary registry that acknowledged unresolved cases. It would require a statement, signatures, and acceptance of language that described Charles P. Mortimer as unconfirmed. They did not fill it out. The decision was made around a kitchen table, much like the one where letters had once been opened. Coffee cooled in mugs, no one lifted. The ring sat between them, catching light from the window. Someone asked, would adding his name change anything? Another answered, it would change how we talk about him. That was enough. They kept the ring. It no longer moved between drawers. It was placed in a small wooden box, lined with fabric that smelled faintly of cedar. Once a year, someone opened the box, lifted the ring, and held it for a moment. No ceremony. No words required. The habit was inherited rather than assigned. A new generation grew up with the story already adjusted. Charles was not described as a missing officer anymore. He was described as someone we waited for. The phrasing mattered. It centered the experience rather than the outcome. Children learn the name before they learn the details. They asked fewer questions. Or perhaps they learned which ones not to ask. One detail surfaced late, almost by accident. A cousin, sorting through an old address book, found a notation beside Charles's name. A pencil mark barely visible. Next to it, a word written in a different hand, left-handed. No one remembered noticing it before. The detail did not appear in letters or stories. It explained nothing. Yet it made him more specific. It suggested a body making choices, favoring one side, adapting to tools and habits. Did anyone know that someone asked? Heads shook. The cousin smiled faintly. I like knowing it, she said. The statement required no justification. The family returned to the wall one last time together. They did not search for his name. They stood back and read others. The scale no longer overwhelmed them. It contextualized their choice. Names were carved because someone had verified them. Charles had not been verified. That fact no longer felt like an omission that needed correction. A younger relative touched the stone lightly. We're not adding him, she said, not as a question. The oldest relative nodded. He doesn't need it, she replied. The exchange was simple, unrecorded, sufficient. What remained of Charles lived in behaviors. In the way, Sundays were still treated differently. In the way, letters were never thrown away quickly. In the way, promises were spoken with care, knowing how long they could echo. These choices, made quietly and consistently, reflect their consistency is visible. They reflect a family that learned to live without external confirmation and did not mistake that for forgetting. The ring was passed down with instructions that were never written. Keep it. Do not assign it a new meaning. Let it be what it was. An object someone carried with the intention of returning. One afternoon, years later, the box was opened again. Dust had settled along the edge. The fabric inside had faded. The ring rested where it had always rested, the engraved letter catching a thin line of light. A thumb traced it once slowly, the way Charles had done without thinking. Then the ring was placed back, the lid closed, and the box returned to its shelf. Exactly where it belonged. Charles P. Mortimer never appeared on the wall. His name does not resolve into stone, does not align with dates and ranks that allow history to close a file. Yet within the Mortimer family, his place is fixed in a different way. He exists in handwriting, remembered by feel, in the expectation of letters that once arrived on Sundays in a ring engraved with a single letter that was meant to come home. The records say little. The investigations end without ceremony. But the family tree keeps his name written carefully, not as proof, but as acknowledgement. Charles remains there because someone once waited for him long enough that removing the name would feel like erasing the waiting itself. There is no final answer to who Charles P. Mortimer was in administrative terms. Whether he was one man or a convergence of several matters, less now than the fact that he shaped decades of attention and care. He taught a family how to hold space for uncertainty without abandoning attachment. The narrator cannot measure the cost of carrying a name history, never confirmed. But the cost is visible in small choices, not adding a name where it might be questioned, not discarding an object whose owner cannot be proven, not insisting on closure when understanding is enough. Charles does not rest in a marked place. He rests instead in practice in how memory is handled, in how absence is respected, in how a family accepts that some lives leave behind echoes rather than endpoints.